And thank you for joining us today. This will be a probably anywhere between 30 to 45-minute workshop, kind of depending on how many questions that we have. SCORE is a resource partner of the Small Business Administration. We help clients at all stages of the business cycle from pre-start to exit through workshops just like this one, but we also do one-on-one mentoring. And we are able to do that not only through the support of the SBA, but majorly through the support of organizations like the Maine Technology Institute, who support our mission and support other small businesses here in the state of Maine. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tom to introduce himself and the Maine Technology Institute and get us kicked off here. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them.
Thanks so much, Dan. Yes, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. We do this every few months, and it's always a lot of fun and get some great questions and dialogue. And we've had a number of MTI applicants come from these workshops, so great to see everybody. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Tom Kittredge. I am a senior investment officer at the Maine Technology Institute, which I'll explain in a moment. I've been with MTI for around 6 years now. Got to work with an incredible array of Maine-based companies, see a lot of success stories. So yeah, just excited to kind of learn a little bit about all of your businesses and share what MTI does. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Dan, is that showing up as it should be?
It is, yes.
Excellent. And you're seeing the actual, you're not seeing my presentation slide, you're just seeing the actual slides.
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, then let's kick it off. Um, so a little bit about the Maine Technology Institute. So we are a nonprofit, but we essentially operate as a quasi state agency. So we were founded by the state of Maine. We're primarily funded through the state of Maine, but we are technically a separate entity. So I'm not a state employee. I'm an employee of the Maine Technology Institute. But you can think of us as really kind of operating in tandem with the state and the state's economic development goals. Um, but like any nonprofit, we're mission driven, and our core mission is to diversify and grow Maine's economy. I'm not going to read this whole mission statement, but essentially what we're looking to do is to support economic development in Maine by supporting innovation. So the hope is that by providing resources to businesses in Maine that are engaged in innovation, that are doing something novel, distinct, that will allow those businesses to grow and create an economic impact here in Maine. So that's really kind of our core mission, innovation as a means to economic prosperity for the state of Maine. So just very briefly on the history of MTI, I won't go into too much depth, but we were established by the legislature back in the late 90s. We were, at the time, Maine was, I think, last or second to last in the nation in terms of investing in innovation and research and development. And so the legislature and the governor at the time kind of perceived that if Maine didn't make an intentional effort to support innovation and to support development in certain key sectors in the state, that there's a chance that the state lags behind the rest of the country in terms of growing those sectors and kind of entering the 21st century. So we were created along with our sister organization, the Maine Angels, excuse me, not Maine Angels, Maine Venture Fund, in the late 90s. Since then, MTI has invested over $387 million in Maine-based companies and organizations, funded 4,350 distinct projects, and then leveraged $2.2 billion in private sector matching investment. So you'll see later on in the presentation that any MTI award comes with a matching funds requirement. So essentially we cost share on projects. So, of the close to 400 million that we've dispersed, it's come with more than 5-to-1 match, which has been great because it means we've been able to attract a lot of additional investment to companies that we're supporting. So this slide here, scope of MTI funding, what it's really seeking to capture is the idea that we work with companies at all different stages who are very early stage to companies that are 20, 30, 40 years old, and maybe are looking to do something different than what they've done historically. And that's where the innovation argument comes from. So we work with companies that are, just at the idea stage, ideally having some amount of validation of that idea, some proof that there's a need for the idea, but they might not even have a prototype yet. All the way, again, as I said, to companies that are commercialized, that are earning revenue, that are maybe even profitable, but are doing something new and distinct from what they've historically done and are seeking to use that to scale their business. So we offer an array of programs. The one I'm going to primarily speak about today is the Business Innovation Funding Program. That's really our core flagship program. It's what a lot of people associate us with. However, we do have a variety of other programs that I did want to put on folks' radar in case they're of any interest. So those include the Maine Entrepreneurial Resource Corps, which is essentially a initiative where we are seeking to provide help for Maine-based businesses who need to hire a Maine-based consultant to do certain work that's going to enable them to scale. So when I go to the business innovation funding description, you'll see there's a variety of projects that we can support. The Maine Entrepreneurial Resource Corps is very specific in terms of what projects it can support. And they're projects where you need to hire a consultant for a short-term project. Now, the project itself that you're hiring a consultant for can vary. It can be anything from hiring a consultant to do marketing work, to help you develop your human resources manual, to do hire an IP patent lawyer or a software engineer. But it needs to be a specific engagement with a consultant who's Maine based. So that's one thing to put on your radar. I will say also a lot of the criteria for the Business Innovation Funding Program also apply to Maine Entrepreneurial Resource Corps. So if you're not a fit to business innovation funding in terms of whether or not you have a strong innovation argument, you probably won't be a fit to the Maine Entrepreneurial Resource Corps. But it is a program I wanted to put on folks' radar. Event sponsorship, that's more for our partners in the ecosystem, entities like SCORE or the Maine Center for Entrepreneurs or Startup Maine or the Rue Institute or other partners in the ecosystem who are offering programs for entrepreneurs. We sponsor some of their events. The federal funding technical assistance program, that is, it's not funding from MTI, it's assistance applying for federal funding. So there are two programs that the federal government offers, SBIR and STTR. I won't bore you with what those acronyms stand for, but essentially those are programs administered by a variety of federal agencies that are intended to support high risk research and development. So they're really tailored on research and development. And high risk being the operative term. So they're looking for things that have a high likelihood of failing, but if they're successful, could be game changers in their respective industries. So what MTI does is we offer free pro bono guidance from some really seasoned experts. My two colleagues who work on this team have both been supporting entrepreneurs applying for these grants for over 20 years each. So they're very familiar with the expectations of these different agencies and how to put forth a compelling application. So that's, again, a free program. You wouldn't get funding from us, but would help you apply for federal funding. But there are a variety of kind of specific requirements around those two programs. Again, the key one really being high risk research and development is what that funding is intended to support. But the funding from that program, there's a variety of phases of funding you can access. I think the first one is up to $75,000 of grant funding, and then the next one is, I think, up to 250,000, and then the third one is even close to 1 million. So they're huge amounts of funding, but again, with a real research and development focus to them. Entrepreneurial support organization funding. So similar to event sponsorship, this is really funding intended to support our partners in the ecosystem, the entrepreneurial support ecosystem. Event sponsorship, as the name suggests, is really focused on supporting events. Entrepreneurial support organization funding, that's more for programmatic offerings. So if an entity is putting together a new accelerator or a new incubator, something like that, that's where MTI could potentially come into play and help support that. And we run that program once a year. So that is a competitive grant funding process. So I'll talk about business innovation funding in a lot more depth in a moment, but we have a rolling deadline for that, and you're not competing against other applicants. You're just being scored against our rubric. The entrepreneurial support organization funding, which we tend to run once a year. I think the plan is the next one's coming out in fall of this year. That is a competition. It only takes place once a year. And then additional programs, on occasion, the state of Maine will ask us to administer certain one-off programs. For example, we recently administered the $25 million R&D bond, MTAF. That was approved by voters a couple of years ago. So when those sorts of bond programs come through the state and are approved, they'll occasionally ask us to be the ones to actually administer them. At the moment, we don't have any of those running, so nothing to have on your radar, but just so you're aware, that's sometimes something that we take on. Okay, so this is really the bulk of what I wanted to talk about today, which is MTI Business Innovation Funding. And again, this is really our flagship program. So what this is grants, loans, and equity investments to businesses to help them scale and innovation for all intents and purposes. Basically, what we're looking to do is if you're a business and you can make an argument that you have an innovation and that if you're able to scale your innovation, that it's going to enable you to generate substantial additional economic impact in Maine through, uh, hiring new people, through growing revenues, and so on. That's really what this funding is intended to support. Grants are capped at 30,000 per award. That changes at various times. So this current cap of 30,000 is what we have in place at the moment. It may change, 6 months from now. We've had it sometimes not capped at all. We sometimes had it capped lower, sometimes higher. But as it stands, the information I can provide is currently capped at 30,000 per award and 100,000 cumulative for grant funding. So essentially what that means is you can come back for MTI after accomplishing a project that's funded at 30,000 and request a follow-on grant. So you can get more than one 30,000 award, but at one time we're only putting out 30,000 at the moment. So the key requirements for the Business Innovation Funding Program, and again, these are fairly analogous to that Maine Entrepreneur Resource Corps as well that I had mentioned, are economic impact potential, innovation forward thinking, Maine-based organizations, 7 targeted technology sectors, and one-to-one access to matching funds. And I'll go into each of those in a little more depth right now. So by economic impact potential, we're really looking at what is the business's credible pathway to growing in the state of Maine? What sort of economic impact potential could the business create in the state of Maine? And how does the innovation argument that they're making enable them to grow in that way and create that economic impact? So linking the innovation and the economic impact piece are really important. If you're coming to MTI and say, hey, I'm going to grow massively over the next 10 years, and I have an innovation, but the innovation isn't why I'm going to grow. The innovation is just something kind of on the side that's not necessarily linked to my growth potential. That even though we love to see the economic impact, the innovation linkage isn't there. And on the same note, if somebody has a really strong innovation argument, but they're not able to show that they're planning to grow as a business, that also wouldn't be there. So we really need to see both of those things and how they interlink together. But in terms of what we mean when we say economic impact, we take a fairly holistic view of it. We're not necessarily looking at one metric as the be all end all. I will say that the creation of quality jobs is definitely a key important metric to us. It's probably the one we look at most closely. But we also look at things like growth and acceleration of revenues, which also leads to tax revenue for the state of Maine that we can then put back out, attraction and leveraging of additional capital or other investments. So if you're bringing in investment capital from outside of the state, and indirect economic impact. And I would say even broader than indirect economic impact, just indirect impact to the state of Maine overall. So indirect economic impact would be things like all of your suppliers are based in Maine. And so if you grow as a business, your suppliers will also benefit. Or, it could be that you're coming forth with an innovation that's going to have a transformational impact on the industry overall because you've discovered something that's going to help other businesses in Maine with the work you're doing. And then other impact beyond that could be, if you're a biomedical company and you've come up with a really crucial life-saving medical device, that would be impact that's beyond economic, but is still benefiting Maine people. I will say that that alone wouldn't meet our impact criteria, but it certainly can be something that you use to boost your impact argument. So the innovation standard, this is probably the area that people have the most questions for MTI because innovation as a concept is a bit nebulous and it's very contextual. It's very much based on the nature of the industry you're in, the nature of your business itself and your competition. So it's case by case, I would say, to an extent, but we try to give some guidance as to what we mean when we say innovation. So typically, we're looking to support the development or commercialization of a product, service, or process that requires solving meaningful technical or scientific challenges, is substantially different from existing alternatives, and drives growth and economic impact through advantages competitors cannot easily replicate. However, to that first bullet point, meaningful technical or scientific challenges, we may accept non-technical innovations The case we give is if there was an Uber or a Facebook in Maine, something that where they were emerging in a market that was very distinct from what business models existed. Those aren't necessarily incredibly technical innovations, but they're kind of game changers, and we want to be able to support those sorts of businesses. But typically, what we're looking to see are the sorts of companies that are solving technical or scientific challenges. So again, research and development, making, breaking, testing, having to run pilot programs, having to, do some meaningful technical or scientific work. And if you're coming to MTI with a non-technical innovation, then we're really looking to see a particularly compelling defensibility, customer demand, and growth potential. So being able to explain, okay, why can your competition not mimic exactly what you're looking to do? Why is there a lot of demand for what you're seeking to do? And why is there high growth potential? So that's kind of the key thing to understand about innovation is being able to articulate how you're different from your competitors, how there's user customer demand for what you're seeking to do, and how you're doing something that's not going to be easy for your competitors to replicate. A few things that don't meet the standard on their own. And on their own is something I really want to emphasize here, because these can all be parts of a great innovation argument, but they're not sufficient on their own to meet the criteria. That have to be part of a broader innovation argument. So, for example, off the shelf equipment or software purchases. So, if you're saying, hey, there's this piece of equipment or this software that's on the market that I'd love to buy, and it's going to help me scale up my business, that on its own wouldn't meet our innovation requirement, but it may be something that's part of a broader project. Routine integration of existing components. So, that's if you're looking to stick together a bunch of pieces of equipment or what have you, or software. Routine being, if there's a lot of custom development work that needs doing, if there's technical issues that need solving to integrate things, that makes it less routine. By routine, we mean if all these things kind of plug and play together fairly easily, that probably wouldn't be innovative enough. AI wrapper applications. So this is something obviously that's emerging more. So by that we mean prompt engineering on existing models. If you're just taking ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini and doing, a little bit of prompt engineering and adding a few kind of bells and whistles, but not really making a major change, that wouldn't be enough in itself. Combining or repackaging existing products or ingredients, incremental improvements, geographic novelty. So sometimes people come to us and say, well, we're doing something that exists in southern Maine, but it doesn't exist in northern Maine. So that's our innovation argument. And unfortunately, that's not generally on its own enough to rise to the level of innovation. Creative works using existing tools, and then relationships, locations, pricing, or branding alone. Again, all of these can be parts of a great argument. They just on their own wouldn't be enough to suffice to make an innovation argument if that's all kind of all you're bringing to the table as your innovation argument. Main-based organizations, I imagine for most of the folks on this call, this shouldn't be an issue. This is more pertinent to companies that are coming to MTI who are based outside of Maine or maybe are only partly based in Maine. But really what we're looking to see are that your business is registered with the Maine Secretary of State Bureau of Corporation, which is just something you file for. I think it's $100 fee, and that basically gives you permission to do business in the state of Maine. Has a regular place of business in Maine. So that just means you're routinely doing business here. We accept home offices, for example, as a regular place of business. What we wouldn't accept is if you just say, oh, well, I have a PO box in Maine or something like that. But if you, as the founder or executive of your business, are in Maine and do business here, that qualifies. We're fairly flexible as to what that means. And then has at least one of the following based in Maine full-time. Either a C-suite W-2 employee, so somebody who's salaried, who's at essentially in a leadership position for your company, who's based in Maine, or a founder or principal with significant equity ownership and an active leadership role. The second piece, the founder or principal, essentially reflects that for early stage companies, sometimes no one within the company is on a salary because you're either, not generating any revenue and there's no way to pay people or what have you. So in the case you don't have a salaried C-suite level W-2 employee, we will accept a founder or principal, but would look to see demonstration that they have a significant equity ownership in the company and an active leadership role. And that second piece is really because we've seen some companies try to get around this by just slapping the term founder on, a low-level employee who doesn't have any equity ownership in the company and is in a leadership role and kind of be like, oh, they're a founder. So you do need to demonstrate that you are, holding an equity ownership in the company and in a leadership role. Um, So the next is the seven technology sectors. So when MTI was created, we were tasked by the state of Maine with supporting seven different technology sectors. I won't read them all, but they're all right here. You can also see them on our website. The key thing I want to emphasize here, actually two key things. One is that either the organization or the innovation has to be in one of those sectors. So if you are a business and you wouldn't classify the business itself as being in one of these sectors. However, if your innovation is in one of these sectors, we could potentially accept you based on the innovation argument. And where that tends to be most common is with information technology, where we'll have businesses who aren't IT businesses. However, they're developing a novel IT-based innovation, a platform, something of that nature. And so the innovation itself qualifies as IT, even though the business doesn't kind of consider itself an IT company. The other thing I'll just note is all of these sectors were created in the late 90s, but thankfully the description for them was left quite vague. And the reason I say thankfully is because, as you can imagine, in pretty much every one of these sectors, technology has evolved significantly since the late 90s. And so if we had a strict definition for these sectors, it would probably no longer be applicable now, but we did not. So we try to roll with the times and evolve our understanding of these sectors with emerging trends and changes. So we tend to be fairly inclusive as to what these sectors mean. So just emphasize that if you're looking at these sectors and you're like, I don't know if I'm a sector fit, we do try to be pretty broad if you can meet the innovation argument and the economic impact argument. And then lastly, access to matching funds. So when we were created as part of our statute with the state of Maine, we were required to have at least one-to-one match for any funding we put out the door. So essentially what that means is we cost share projects. So if you come to MTI and you say, hey, I have a project that's going to help me move my innovation forward, and that's going to help me grow my business and create economic impact, and that project's going to cost $50,000, MTI could potentially put in up to half of that, $25,000, with the expectation that your business is covering the other half of the project expenses. So in terms of where that match comes from, we're quite flexible. So we've had people match an MTI project with their own personal funds, with a bank loan, with a credit card, with outside investment. If you're generating revenue, you can match it with that revenue. You do need to demonstrate to MTI that that revenue is pretty locked in. It can't be speculative revenue, but if you're already generating revenue and it's pretty consistent, you could potentially use that as match. So we're other grant funding can be used as a match. So we've had people get grants from other sources that they then use to match an MTI request, which could be a great way to leverage, both of our respective grants. The only limitations in terms of what we can accept as match are it can't be other state of Maine funding. So because we receive our money from the state of Maine and from state of Maine taxpayers, you can't use state of Maine taxpayer money to match an MTI request. There aren't a ton of other state of Maine based programs that are even available, but sometimes if you get investment from the Maine Venture Fund, for example, or if you win certain pitch competitions, that's where it can get a little dicey. But again, that's fairly rare. The match does need to be money that you're planning to spend on the project you're proposing to MTI. So you can't say, well, I spent $20,000 a year ago on my business. I'm going to count that as match. It needs to be forward-looking match that's going to the same project that the MTI funding would be going to. And then lastly, I'll just mention these bullet points here, which is you can see that there's a cash minimum 50% for up to 15,000 cumulative, 70% for up to 30,000 cumulative. And what that's getting at is that we can accept a part of your match as not cash. So what that typically looks like is if you're a founder and you're not being paid to do work on your project. So this is the norm, not the norm. This is much more common for very early stage businesses where the founders aren't drawing a salary, where they're not being compensated. We can accept a portion of the work that you're putting towards the project as in-kind match, also known as sweat equity. So if you're going to say, well, I'm going to put 100 hours of my own personal work towards this MTI funded project. Oh, I'm hearing a little. Oh, there we go. If you're putting your own personal time towards a project, you can kind of take the market value of the work you're putting to the project and count that as part of your match. However, we're looking to see a minimum of cash as part of the match. So again, 50% cash minimum, so up to 15,000 cumulative, and then up to 70% cash minimum, a minimum of 70% cash for 15 to 30,000. Expectations scale with cumulative funding. So this really gets at the idea. So I mentioned the cumulative funding. I've said cumulative a lot. Basically, when MTI looks at what amount of funding you're eligible for, we take into account previous funding you've received to us. So up to 30K, as I mentioned, that's our current grant cap limit anyway. So this green section up to 30K, that would be a typical first MTI grant. And this would be the minimum expectation of what you have to demonstrate to get up to 30,000 from us in terms of stage of your business. If you came back to us for a follow-on grant to build on that up to 30,000 you got from us, you'd probably have to show this purple section, the show your work section. And then if you came back for a third grant, you'd have to show the prove you're ready. And again, this is really all the other things I said about fit are still still apply here, but this is really in terms of stage of business, what we're looking for at different grant funding levels. So at up to 30,000, we're willing to take some fairly large risks on very early stage companies because we're seeking to seed the ecosystem. We're seeking to support early stage businesses, and we want to take risks and understand that not all of these businesses are going to succeed. But you do need to demonstrate that you have an innovative concept and a credible plan to develop it. Initial customer discovery. So you've talked to potential customers that have validated that there's potential interest in the market, and aspirational impact projections grounded in logic. So you can put forth economic impact projections that we recognize are aspirational, but they're grounded in some degree of logic. When you say, oh, I think I'm going to hit X number of revenue in a few years or X number of employees, that you could at least demonstrate how you got to those numbers. 30 to 60K, we're looking to see documented development progress. So as I mentioned, at an early stage, you don't necessarily need to have a prototype or a minimum viable product. Often that's what this $30,000 of funding would go to support, is developing those products. But from 30 to 60K, we want to see you're either have a prototype or minimum viable product or making meaningful work to getting one, additional customer evidence, validated cost estimates, and a credible path to profitability. And then 60 to 100K, that's really where we are hoping you're getting close to commercializing. So we really want to see companies that are kind of on the cusp of getting their product on the market and have tested the innovation with real world results, maybe run a pilot program, validated customer demand with tangible commitments. So maybe you have pre-orders, maybe you have letters of interest, some form of actual, real documented evidence that customers want what you're bringing to the market. And then comprehensive financial projections. So you're able to forecast out with a degree of confidence what sort of revenue you're projecting, what sort of expenses you're going to have. So that's kind of how things look. I think there might be a little background noise. So that's kind of what our expectations, how they scale with cumulative funding. So I'm getting close. This is slide 15 of 20. So what MTI funds and what it doesn't. So these are typical projects that are a good fit for MTI here on the left. And then these are projects that typically aren't a good fit for MTI on the right. So things that are typically a good fit for MTI, R&D, research and development, and technical development. So things like prototyping, testing, formulation, lab work, IP work. So patent searches, filings, freedom to operate, pilot programs with real customers, engineering and design work, key hires that unblock technical or commercial progress. So not any hire, but if you're able to demonstrate that a hire is going to help you move your innovation forward because they have very particular technical skills or are going to help you bring your product to market, that could potentially be a fit. Regulatory work that advances innovation. So those tend to all be really squarely in the wheelhouse of what we're looking to support. Things we don't fund, so routine operating expenses, so rent, utilities, general overhead, those aren't generally a fit for us. Once in a while, when it comes to rent, if you're a company that needs to access lab space or a really kind of niche space that's going to allow you to advance your innovation and a space that's not necessarily easily accessible, we could potentially support that. But that's kind of the one place where rent would be allowed. Marketing and advertising spend, there can be a little bit of flexibility on this, but it wouldn't be the bulk of an MTI project. It would more be a side thing rather than kind of the key part of it. Inventory or production scale up isn't really a fit for MTI. You're welcome to buy enough inventory to test your project if you're running a pilot program. But if it's just trying to bulk up your inventory or production, that's generally not a fit for us. Working capital debt service or refinancing, definitely not a fit. Equipment that's not tied to the innovation. So if it's just general equipment your company needs, but it's not linked to scaling the innovation, that wouldn't be a fit. I already mentioned retroactive funding. General sales activities, also not typically a fit. In terms of what we're looking to see in an application, in terms of how you'd be scored if you were to submit an application for MTI support, the six things we look at, they're all things I've mostly touched on already. Innovation and value proposition. Is the innovation real, differentiated, and validated by potential customers? Again, that validated by potential customers is really important. Even at the very earliest stages, we're looking for you to be able to speak to how you've gotten feedback from potential customers about your idea, even if it's just you sent out a survey or you talked to some people at a very high level about your idea. We want to know that you're kind of beginning to test it and get feedback. Team, do you have the people skills and oversight to execute this project? Our expectations with team vary at different levels. So if you're a very early stage founder, that's fine. But we want to see you have good advisors or mentors or people supporting you. Whereas if you're a later stage company that's coming back for follow-on funding, we're typically looking to see that you have in-house levels of expertise and technical skills. Market opportunity. So is there a real market and credible path to reaching customers? I always note that I think SCORE is a really great resource for people who are looking to do market research and maybe aren't familiar with how to conduct it. But being able to speak to the market and the opportunity is something we look at. Business models and financials. Again, early stage companies, we're a lot more flexible when it comes to the business model and financials. We're not looking for a very detailed model. We just want to feel like what you're generally proposing checks out and makes sense. But for later stage companies, we're looking for more detailed financial projections. Impact and connection to Maine, which I've already touched on significantly, but we're looking to see that you can put forth a vision for how your business is going to grow in Maine and create impact. And then project structure. So what are you looking to do with MTI funds? Do you have matching funds? Are there clear deliverables linked to your project where we can measure at the end of the project, was it successful? And are these the right activities for your stage? So are you proposing a project that makes sense? Sometimes we have people come to us and they say they want to do this big marketing and sales campaign, but they don't even have a prototype yet. And we're like, well, why don't you focus on getting the product before you start investing in marketing and sales? So does the project kind of make sense in the context of where you are as a business? Application process. So if you're interested in MTI funding, if you think you could potentially be a good fit, the first thing I'd recommend is take the self-assessment test, which is on our website. It's a great way to kind of go in more depth as to all the things I've touched on and determine whether or not you're a good candidate for MTI funding. The self-assessment is totally for you. It's not going to dictate whether or not you get MTI funding. We don't look at the results and say, well, you self-assessed is not a fit, so you're not eligible. It's really just intended as an informational tool to help people get a sense as to whether or not they're a good fit. If you do self-assess as not being a fit, you're still welcome to reach out to us and say, hey, I self-assessed as not being a fit, but I think I could be, for whatever reason. Or if you self-assess and it says, yeah, it does look like I'm a good fit. Either way, you can submit an interest form via our website, which is basically a request to speak to myself or one of my colleagues. Once you submit that interest form, one of us will email you, set up a time to talk. We typically either do a phone call or we'll do a Zoom call or a Teams call. It's really an informal conversation where we talk more through your business, try to get a sense of whether or not it sounds like it's worth it for you to submit an application. And then if we determine it does make sense, and again, that's a collaborative conversation. We're not trying to tell people in those conversations, no, you're not allowed to apply. We always tell people they're welcome to submit an application, but we're trying to give you a good sense as to whether or not you're likely to be successful, because we don't want you to waste all the time putting together an MTI application that has no shot at being successful. But if you do decide to apply, your investment officer would send you the documents. So we have three templates: a scope of work, which is really just how do you describe your project; a budget, which is what are the expenses associated with the project, and how much are you seeking from MTI; what are you bringing as matching funds; and then the application, which touches on those sections I talked about in the last slide. Await MTI funding decision. It says generally around 2 months. We've actually managed to speed that up. So we're getting closer to probably 4 to 5 weeks now, which is great. And then if approved, ongoing reporting requirements as detailed in funding contracts. So for a grant, typically all you have to do is submit a final report at the end of the project saying, here's how the grant went, here's how the project went, these were my expenses, project summary. For other types of funding that we offer, sometimes there's slightly more intensive reporting requirements. When you're ready to talk to us, so really basically what this says is I touched on the things that are in the application. You should be able to speak to each of those things in the application, but these are really some key items that are worth being able to speak to. So what's the problem you're seeking to solve? What's your innovation? What customer discovery have you conducted to date? Who's on your team? What is the competitive landscape and market opportunity? So being able to speak to your competition is very helpful. And then the resources you need to move your innovation forward. So again, what's that project look like? I already touched on the self-assessment tool, but again, just to highlight, it's on our website. It's a really great tool to get a sense of whether or not you're likely to be a fit for business innovation funding. Again, it's not something that's gonna the results aren't going to be held against you. So if you self-assess and it's a no, no one's going to look at that and be like, well, you self-assessed as a no, so you're not allowed to apply. It's really just for your own information. And depending on how you result, we'll send you a follow-up email saying, here's how you did. If you self-assess as a no, we'll give you some very tangible reasons why you were a no, and then also some suggestions on some resources available in Maine that you can utilize. And that is everything. So thank you all for bearing with me. I know that was 40 minutes, but hopefully that was helpful, and happy to take any questions people might have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom, for talking to us about the Maine Technology Institute. There are a lot of different areas in which you cover those different sectors. We have a few folks in the chat from across different industries. We have someone who does CNC. We have someone else who's helped another company get MTI funding. And looks like a career coaching company. So we have a wide variety of folks here. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Or if you'd like to unmute yourself or use the raise hand function, feel free to do that, and you can just ask your question directly.
Hi, Tom. It's Emily Bryson.
Hi, Emily.
So I've been exploring the MTI website and I already did the self-assessment for funding on the
Okay.
website. And so my husband, it's really my husband's business, but I'm helping with but I've named myself his CFO, helping with the financial piece of it with him. And so he services and calibrates CNC machine tools, and there's a little used process of calibration that he wants to continue to develop, but we're very, very early. Like he just started his company in February, and he's super busy working on other things, which is great because it's income for our family, which we appreciate. We've got a couple of kids, but we don't have a lot of time to do. He doesn't have a ton of time for like writing out these formal reports and processes, and he's got all this knowledge in his head that I'm trying to gather. And I'm just wondering, like, if we wanted to talk with someone at MTI about um, funding, like how much do we need to be prepared? I saw this was helpful to get kind of an idea of what you're looking for and what the questions are, but like I am just curious, is it okay if we go and just share what we have now and get a better idea of what to expect? Or would you really want us to be more organized and have it written out and have a formal sort of like proposal created
No, you
before?
definitely don't need to have anything written out. I would say the whole part of the reason that we do these intake calls is to avoid making people jump through all these hoops and write stuff out when they might not be a fit at all.
Right. Yeah.
There's a brief
I'm worried about
when you submit an interest form, you have to fill out, I think it's 3 questions, asking you to talk to the innovation, differentiation, and what sort of funding you're seeking from MTI. That's really just to help encourage people to at least think about innovation. Previously,
Mhm.
we used to have people come to us who are running campgrounds or bed and breakfasts, or who weren't, there was no innovation argument really at all, but they were just seeking funding. So we do ask a few questions in the intake, but
Mhm.
they're really to make people think themselves, am I doing something innovative, rather than
Yeah.
something that we're going to use preemptively to decide whether or not you're innovative. um, but other than that, you don't really need to prep anything. You should just be able to speak to your business, and my colleagues or myself might have questions for you, and depending on whether or not you're able to answer them, we might say, oh, well, we suggest you do a little research or work on this. But also
Mhm.
MTI, if it's just at your early stage, we never tell people, no, you're not allowed to apply ever. We might just say, well, for you to submit a compelling application, we suggest that you research this or this first.
Yeah.
So that's what we would say. But they're really informal conversations. They're intended to be very friendly and welcoming, and help people get a sense as to whether or not they're a fit to MTI, rather than kind of interview or interrogation or anything like that.
All right. That sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, do we have any other questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself. Christy, it looks like you're unmuted.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, Chrissy.
Oh, hold on one second. In a minute.
Oh, we could hear you, Christy. It looks like you're muted again, or maybe that was intentional.
Hi, this is Christy. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
I couldn't find the link and I got into the webinar late. Are you sending the slides and the recording?
Yes, I will send out the slide deck and the recording for this workshop.
And I don't live in the main area, but I have signed up for your workshops. Would I still be able to do the survey about the grant?
The self-assessment.
Yes.
You could do the self-assessment, absolutely. To be eligible for MTI funding, you'd have to be a Maine-based business. I mean, the self-assessment can be useful for anyone, just to learn about their business. But if you're seeking funding, then yes, you'd need to be a Maine-based business.
Okay, but I could do the assessment. That's good.
Yeah, you could absolutely do the assessment if it is helpful to just learn more about your business. Yeah, absolutely. There's no criteria stopping you from doing it if you're not based in Maine.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned, I will be sending out the recording and the slide deck for this workshop to everyone who's registered. And so one, thank you for joining us, and thank you to Tom for joining us and telling us about the Maine Technology Institute and the different offerings that you have available. And of course, always remember that if you do not have a SCORE mentor, you can always go to score.org to find and click on Find a Mentor to find a SCORE mentor and get started today. Hope you have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Great to see you all. Take care.